So thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's a real privilege to be able to come and tell you some of the things we're doing in chemistry that I think are quite interesting, and hopefully you will agree are quite interesting. There is a bit of maths in this presentation, but I am not very good at maths at all, so I sort of know enough to be dangerous but not enough to be useful, hence coming to see you. So please be tolerant when I completely mess up all of the equations and mathematics in this presentation. My talk is sort of vaguely called Complex Problems in Colloid and Surface Chemistry, which is a vigorously pompous title, and I apologise for that. What I will do at the start is to introduce colloid chemistry to you. For those of you who are not very familiar, is anyone here sort of extremely familiar and happy with colloid chemistry, or do you want some basics? Okay, great. So colloids are a field of chemistry, the sort of bridge chemistry, physics, engineering, math and biology. It's really just a discipline united by a length scale. So what we're really talking about is finely divided systems, or systems with typical internal length scales on the nanometer to micron size range. And so our finely divided system could take the form of droplets, bubbles, particles, or other sundry squashy things that share similar length scales. So, for example, the internal dimensions of liquid crystals, the internal dimensions of granular biological matter. And I like to think of colloid chemistry as the thing that links molecular chemistry, so bolting together of atoms into molecules and substances, to actual bulk properties that the world is interested in. And so as a colloid chemist you can do almost anything and still call yourself a colloid chemist. So it's a very diverse discipline. I finally found a use for all of the graphical abstracts that we feverishly make for our papers, just to show you some of the diverse things we do in our group. And for the purposes of this talk, what I really want to indicate to you is that we are the type of chemists who get excited by the shape of squishy things and fluid interfaces, generally in the presence of interesting molecules or particles, so things that we've added to the system to control properties, things that self-assemble, so for thermodynamic reasons, orient themselves into larger, more complicated structures. We're also very interested in naked fluid interfaces, so fluid interfaces undressed by molecules or particles, but looking exactly what they do in various conditions and at various size scales. And of course, these systems get much more interesting when you add time as a dimension, when things are moving around, so flow and dynamics, because in real life, most processes of interest are dynamic. The system is never really at equilibrium or at rest. And here are some examples, everyday examples of colloidal systems. So we work on a lot of food projects. We're very sort of outward facing as a group, so we work on a lot of industry projects, things like foods, paints, materials. Milk is an obvious example of a colloidal system, tiny droplets of fat dispersed in water. Blood is a colloidal system. It's got lots of squishy granular matter inside a continuous fluid. I'm not suggesting that methamphetamine is a colloidal system, but that the liquid crystal in this liquid crystal display television is indeed a colloidal system. So you can see colloids are a big business. They're pretty much everywhere. And an understanding of how colloidal systems behave is really implicit in driving key Australian industries forward and in driving scientific thought forward in some really fundamental and important areas. So our problems. We have many problems, most of them scientific in nature. What we're really interested in understanding is how systems behave as a function of length scale, time scale, and as a function of the components present. The complexities of colloidal systems really are that the stability is usually controlled by a set of complicated forces that arrive from all of the different components in the system. Most systems are not, in the world of colloid science, thermodynamically stable. They might be kinetically stable, or they might be metastable, stable for a period of time, but thermodynamically unstable with respect to their theoretically phase-separated or resolved components. Most of the interesting problems that have yet to be solved are dynamic, parameterized in time, which usually makes things more complicated, too complicated for us to solve ourselves. And we will often combine data from different measurements, techniques, or sources to try and understand the true complexity of a system. So in general, where we seek the advice of mathematicians is to extract meaning from experimental data by modeling it, or making theoretical predictions that we can then test, verify experimentally ourselves. So either direction, a push or a pull from mathematical modelling, but mathematical modelling has to be implicit in what we do. I picked two problems that I'm most excited about at the moment to present to you today, and by the time I'd finished making the slides for the first one, I realised that was probably already about 20 minutes, so I would not talk about the second one. But if anyone is interested in coupled absorption kinetic diffusion equations, then please do come and talk to me anyway. The thing I'm going to talk to you about today, because it's very pertinent to a number of research themes in the school, and particularly in my group, is the idea of dynamic interactions in soft systems, and as Kate indicated, I've been interested in this for quite some time. I want to start by showing you some pretty videos, and I really hope they work because we tested them, so they should work. I'll explain what you're seeing before you see it. What you're about to see is the interaction of a soft body, so a bubble in this case, an air bubble, which is being blown from a capillary. So imagine this is my capillary. I'm going to blow an air bubble in water against a surface. And I'm going to look at what happens in between the bubble and the surface using interferometry. And I'll show you a bit more about interferometry in a moment, but it's really just a light-based technique that uses the sort of quantized nature of light, the specific wavelengths in light, to arise interference patterns. So let's have a look at the data. So this is a video of a bubble approaching and interacting with a surface. And this bubble is going to retain a liquid film between the air and the surface at all times. And you can see you get this very pretty sequence of images, or video in this case, that indicates the profile of the intervening liquid. So as the bubble, I should be drawing this really, as the bubble interacts with the surface, the profile of the liquid film underneath changes in a dynamic fashion. And an important question is, what are the forces acting on the interfaces that result in this behaviour? Well, we have a complex set of forces. We've got surface forces, so we've got things like the charge in the system, so the bubble interface and the glass interface below it are going to be charged. We've got the van der Waals interaction, ubiquitous electrodynamic interaction that exists between all matter. And we've also got hydrodynamic interaction in this instance. There's obviously also something the bubble is doing, because if the bubble wasn't doing something to the rest of the system and yet forces were happening to the bubble, it would disappear off into space. So there must be a restorative force, and in this case it's the surface tension force that wants to keep the bubble spherical and is pushing back against all of these other things happening to the interface. Now that's quite cool, and we did this with blue light, as you can see, hence the glowing blue background. We can also do the same experiment with white light. In this case, the interference of light within the film, within the different thicknesses of the film as it evolves, results in different colours. And this makes the problem very difficult to solve, but is much more rich in information, as you can imagine, because instead of having a single wavelength of light, I've now got all wavelengths of light involved in this interaction. Now, why am I showing you this? Because we would like to be able to understand this system fully and completely. So here are the bits we've successfully done. Already today, I have shown you that we can observe the thin liquid film between a soft body, a bubble or a drop, and a surface, or between two soft objects. If I put another bubble there, we could do the same experiment. We can use interferometry to determine the profile of the liquid film. So this thin, very thin, nanometer thin intervening liquid film underneath the bubble can be visualized using this interferometry technique with unique spatial fidelity. And we can convert that into the actual profile of the liquid film. What we really want to be able to do is to model what that film should look like as a function of time based on our understanding of the forces in the system, because we know how water moves, we know how hydrodynamics works, we know the Laplace pressure in the bubble that comes from the surface tension, and we know the surface forces in the system because we can measure the charge and we can calculate van der Waals. So knowing those things, we should be able to predict what we see. Before we do that, I'll just show you the math, because this is the bit of math I can do and I wanted to show off. Quite complicated equations, I think you'll agree, so I must be really good I'm not very good at math. This is the master equation for interferometry, so it basically just tells you the intensity of the different colours of light as a function of their wavelength and as a function of the separation in the system, which is d, so the thickness of the film under that bubble there. This is just the Fresnel equation to tell you how intense your reflections from the interfaces should be. And the major advance we made in understanding this problem was to say that in real systems, if you're using a real camera like this camera here, then the sensors in the camera, the different color sensors, have different sensitivities to different wavelengths of light. And if you account for that, it explains why you start off with these beautifully resolved colors for very thin separations, for really thin films, that sort of even out to grey as you go off into space. And you've probably seen this phenomenon in refraction and interference in your sort of daily lives. And the net result of that is that you can solve colour interferometry much more simply than was previously believed. And we published this year. If you use this, you can extract the film profile. So we know this is the shape of the bubble. Obviously, it's an exaggerated y-axis here. We've got nanometers in this dimension and microns in this dimension. This is the profile of the bubble as it interacts with the surface. As the bubble comes towards the surface, a dimple forms, which is the hydrodynamic resistance of the liquid underneath it. The water can't escape quick enough, and then the water slowly drains through this barrier rim at the edge of the bubble. Quite nice. Now, there is a model that can account for this process, the Stokes-Reynolds Young-Laplace model. So it's coupling the Young-Laplace equation for the shape of the interface, the interfacial deformation, with Stokes-Reynolds, so Stokes drag, hydrodynamic drag, and Reynolds lubrication theory, so drainage in a thin film. And it was arrived at by Chan, D'Agostino, and White, Chan being the mathematician mostly responsible for its derivation. And you can see this is just the Young-Laplace equation accounting for deformation of the interface as a function of radial dimension and the film thickness, and that's the hydrodynamic pressure, and that's the surface pressure or surface disjoining pressure from the surface forces. So things we can calculate, things that are complicated but we can calculate, and couple that to deformation. The temporal evolution of water film thickness is an assumption of Reynolds lubrication theory, and that's how this should change with time. I don't know much about that one. But this is a well-established and well-utilised theory. Using this theory, you can calculate data from all sorts of different systems, and this will hopefully mean something to you. In the paper, it pretty much says it's trivial to solve these equations. It is trivial to show using the method of lines. It is trivial to show, meaning that it's less than 4 pages of MATLAB. It's apparently a couple of pages of MATLAB code to run those models and to be able to calculate interfacial profiles as a function of time and spatial dimensions and surface forces. So it can be done if you know a bit of fluid dynamics, and you can solve a partial differential equation using whatever the method of lines might be. Now, how am I doing for time? Oh, God. All right. I'm going to skip that and that and that. Using these techniques, so interferometry and using atomic force microscopy, which I won't have time to talk about, we can model a lot of simple systems. So we've basically done all the simple stuff already, right? The simple stuff has been handled. Oil drops in water, water drops in oil, air bubbles in water, all the boring stuff. Not boring, very exciting. All of the relatively simple systems that underpin what I want to do next. What I want to do next is one major problem and one minor problem that's sort of relatively easy to solve. The minor problem is moving to bigger drops, so larger Reynolds number, where essentially Reynolds lubrication theory may not be implicit, so squeezing flow may not be implicit in the solution. That's very industrially relevant for real emulsion and fluid handling. The one I'm more excited about is structured and non-Newtonian fluids. So if I make my film liquid, instead of water, I make it something non-Newtonian, where viscosity changes as a function of shear rate, as a function of how fast things are moving. The problem gets really, really juicy, really interesting, and has not been solved. And Derek refuses to solve it. So I come to you on bended knee and say, please, wise mathematicians of Monash, can you help me? And I just want to show you one last thing before I finish. So why is it so hard? Well, in this equation that accounts for deformation of the droplets as a function of radial dimension, the pressure acting on them is now not consistent with time. It's now going to change with time. And just as I finish, I will show you an interesting thing. This is the thing that we're working on. Literally, this data is from this week. These two videos demonstrate that we've established a new technique for actually visualizing the flow in three-dimensional space. So we can visualize fluid flow in 3D space. That is the three-dimensional flow of a non-Newtonian fluid in real time, in real space. How extraordinary is that? Really cool. So we can actually visualize the problem, so we can directly prove if your modeling has worked. So with that, I will well and truly finish, and I apologize for running over, but it wasn't entirely my fault. So thank you very much for your attention.